In this report, I explain why living costs in the Philippines range from about $800 per month to $5,000 per month, depending on two variables you need to watch in order to stay within budget. Since I left the USA in 2007, I've lived in or visited 67 countries in the world. I've met more expats living overseas than I can remember over the last 15 years. But I would guess that 90% of the expats' living costs range from about $800 to $5,000 per month worldwide. Whereas most of the expats I meet in the retire cheap in paradise countries seem to be living in the range of about $1,200 to $3,000 per month. So are you wondering what it would cost you to retire overseas? Well, stick with me for a minute, and I think this video will help you figure that out. After I define a few things, I will give you example living costs based upon the kind of life you'll be living in retirement, and I'll give you some Philippines living cost examples once I set the two main variables and explain them to you. There are two expat behaviors that seem to affect living costs more than any others. I'll explain these two variables, how they are related, and how you need to consider both when trying to figure out what your budget will be as an expat in the Philippines or any other retired cheap in paradise country. So the two largest cost variables for expats. The first variable I call the integration spectrum. If you follow my channel, you've heard me talk about the first variable before, but today I'm giving it a name. I'll call it the integration spectrum. The integration spectrum ranges from the lowest cost of living possible, which is a complete integration into the local culture, all the way up to the highest cost of living possible, which is achieved by living completely in a bubble with almost no contact with the local culture. If you live with the locals, eat with the locals, and play with the locals, then you are fully integrated into the local culture. An expat that fully integrates into the local culture will be able to live on the locals' budget or close to it. A fully integrated expat would have the lowest potential cost of living on the integration spectrum, whereas your cost of living escalates rapidly if you try to live overseas in an expat bubble. Most expats live at least partially in an expat bubble. They may live in nicer housing than the average local. They may eat and drink in more expensive foreign bars and restaurants than the average local. They may have more expensive cars, trucks, and toys than the average local. They may spend more on trips and entertainment than the average local. And they may also hang out exclusively with other expats. In order to determine where you will live on the integration spectrum, you'll have to do an exploratory visit and do a cost analysis in whatever country you're thinking. You'll have to put your feet on the ground and see with your own eyes before you'll know where you will be on the integration spectrum and what your cost of living will be. Okay, time for a brief explanation of the second variable. The second variable is called the travel frequency spectrum. Some expats move overseas and just stay in one location for multiple years in a row. If an expat remains stationary in a single location when they move overseas, then they have almost no additional costs on the travel frequency spectrum. They are stationary. They just pay their local rents, food, and other expenses, but they have no additional travel costs. However, other expats like to spend money traveling around their new country. Depending on how often they travel, and how long they stay when they are away from their home base, their travel expenses will vary greatly. Other expats are like me. They like to slow travel around the world. The cost to slow travel the world will depend greatly on a number of factors, such as how often you move between places, the number of international and intercontinental flights that you take per year, whether or not you maintain an empty bed somewhere in the world as you travel, whether instead of an empty bed, you slowly move forward through the world, completely exploring each new country within a continent before you buy an expensive intercontinental flight. A high frequency of moving between locations in a country or the world explodes your budget for a number of reasons. First, you'll have to pay for the travel between destinations. This could be significant depending on how much ground travel you use versus airfare. A high travel frequency is much more expensive in your nightly rate for accommodations. If you stay for a month or more in each place, it's easier to get a bargain on rents because the landlord knows they will have no vacancy for an entire month. Finally, if you move forward slowly and never buy round-trip tickets back to an empty bed somewhere, there's no empty bed or apartment that you are still paying for back home as you travel around the world. So a high frequency of travel means a shorter duration in each location. A shorter duration in each location means higher rents, but also means paying travel costs more often because of the frequency of the move. Now I will explain how these two variables together drive your higher or lower annual cost of living. Okay, this 4-quadrant graph that I'm showing you, I'll use is explaining what the 4 main different kinds of travelers are. Now, the first is called stationary integration. That's the bottom left-hand corner of the chart. This is the cheapest lifestyle. The cheapest way to live outside your home country is represented in the lower left quadrant. It's called a stationary integration. Stationary means that you move locations rarely, if at all, each year. Maybe you go home for a week or two every other year, and you go on a day trips from your base in the foreign country. Maybe you go for a week or two every other year and go on day trips from your foreign station base. But you are not a frequent traveler once you move to a foreign country. Integration means that you live more like the locals than a bubble expat. You learn about the culture and you live to some degree like a local. The reason the stationary integration is light colored green is that it is the cheapest way to live. It takes less green. Okay, what about stationary bubble? The stationary bubble quadrant means that you are stationary, as mentioned, you don't move much, but the bubble means that you try to create your old life in your new country. You eat and drink in expat restaurants or foreign restaurants, you rent Western style accommodations, and most likely you're trying to get local people to do things like you expect them to be done at home. You spend less time in the student mode in life and more time in the teacher mode telling other people how things should be done. The color is much greener than the stationary integration once you're in a stationary bubble because the expat lifestyle can cost 2 or 3 times as much or more than living like a local. Okay, frequent integration box. The frequent implies that you move places throughout the year more frequently. You might even be what I call a slow traveler. To learn more about the slow travel world highway, I have a link to a report you can read. As I said before, we traveled to 30 different places in 6 different countries in 2021. Frequent travel can get expensive, but the way we try to keep expenses low is to live like a local as much as possible as we visit each new city in a country or each new country as we travel the world. We like to learn about and cook the local foods, stay in cheaper, more local accommodations whenever possible, and learn about the culture we are in. Learning about the locals and trying to live more like them is the second part of the frequent integration. So frequent integration travel costs more than a stationary integration, but less than the last quadrant I will now explain, which is called a frequent bubble. If you move places frequently and stay in Western style accommodations, eat in Western style restaurants, and hang out mostly with other expats doing the same as you, your life will represent a frequent traveling bubble lifestyle. The frequent travel that wants to recreate their old life in the new country will be the most expensive way to live at all. That is why it is darkest green color. The sky is the limit in a frequent bubble. Okay, now I'll give you example Philippines cost of living based upon the 2 variables. As shown in the 4-quadrant graph, you have all 4 quadrants here, and I'll talk about each. Okay, see the little number there under stationary integration? Let's call that price point 1. At price point 1, you have the potential to live on about $800 per month as an expat in the Philippines, living in a stationary integration. You integrate into the local population for the most part, meaning you live like a local amongst the locals. You live in local style accommodations, you stay out of expensive expat restaurants, you cook local foods at home, and you eat in local style restaurants with locals. You seek your entertainment with the locals, meaning you befriend and play with the locals. You may have a few expat experiences in any given month, but mostly you follow the lead of the local lifestyle. At price point 1, your cost of living will range from about $600 per month to about $1,000 per month, depending on how strictly and willing you are to live like a local. Okay, price point 2. At price point 2 on the graph, you have the potential to live on about $1,200 per month US as an expat on the low end of the stationary bubble in the Philippines. You're willing to pay more in rent to have a more Western style apartment. You may pay more in utilities, including a premium internet bandwidth. You spend more time with other expats than locals. You're willing to eat in expat restaurants from time to time and pay more for imported foods, even some imported alcohol from home, rather than shop exclusively in open air local markets. You also spend more money on exploring the world around you, taking excursions and that kind of thing, which expats tend to do. At price point 2, your cost of living will range from about $1,200 per month to $2,500 per month, depending on how extreme or expensive the expat bubble is that you decide to leave. And those are just averages. It can go higher. Price point 3. At price point 3, you have the potential to live on about $1,200 per month as an expat. That is not stationary, but moves frequently while integrated into the local population as a frequent integration in the Philippines. You integrate into the local population, moving to a new place every month or so in the Philippines. As you move forward slowly through the Philippines, slow traveling, you do not maintain an empty bed anywhere in the Philippines. When you move between places, you ride on ferries between islands instead of flying, and you ride on local transportations like jeepneys and tricycles and motorcycles. You eat with locals, you stay in local style temporary accommodations, and you seek mostly do-it-yourself style excursions while riding around on public transportation and watching what the locals are up to. At price point 3, your cost of living will range from about $1,200 per month to $1,600 per month, depending on how competent you are in exploring the Philippines like a local instead of an expat. Okay, price point 4. You have the potential to live on about $2,400 per month as an expat that is not stationary, but explores new places every week or two while living in an expat bubble. Moving through the Philippines while living in an expat bubble. Okay, you stay in a furnished Airbnb apartments, paying weekly instead of monthly rates. You eat almost exclusively in expat restaurants. You cook imported foods you bought in air-conditioned supermarket instead of an open-air local market. You take paid tourist excursions frequently as you explore each part of the Philippines. At price point 4, your cost of living will range from about $1,800 per month to $5,000 per month, depending on how extravagant and frequent the bubble is that you travel. But you could easily spend much more if you are a baller and money is no object. We are headed back to the Philippines tomorrow. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notifications bell if you want to watch us travel through the Philippines slowly. Okay, now you know why living costs in the Philippines range from about $800,000 to $500,000 US per month. But if you'd like to know example costs of living in 4 different cities in the Philippines, just click on the YouTube playlist for the Philippines in the upper left-hand corner of the screen when this video ends. This is Dan of Vagabond Awake, the YouTube channel for vagabondbuddha.com. The world is your home. What time will you be home for dinner? Hey, if you liked our video, please like, comment, or subscribe. Any of that would help our business. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Click the link in the notes below this video to get a copy of this content. Plus, grab a free copy of my ebook, How I Fired My Boss and Traveled the World for 13 Years. While you're there, check out our catalog of retired cheap reports all over the world and our hobby income course that we just released. Thanks so much.